Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Recording in progress. Thank you, John.
You're
Appreciate it.
welcome.
Eric and Hank, good evening. Congratulations to the new officers, and appreciate those individuals that are new relatively to stepping up and carrying on a tradition. As indicated, I'm going to talk a little bit about defensive bees and then with Africanized bees. I looked up, I have my Man Lake catalog for 2022, and I looked up on page 106, and it has the easy check, but it doesn't have that one as that it's adapted to use a carbon dioxide. So maybe they must have adapted it. It must be something different because it's not, and the catalog is done like, this time of the year for next year. So maybe this is something that's a little bit different. On the opposing page on 107, if you have your catalog, there's a Verox Eddy. And if you like LED lights and blinking and bells and whistles and things, it's a brand new way to administer oxalic vaporization. The machines now go from like $500 down to $130. And this is right up there at the high end if you like it. But if you like the lights and the blinking, that'll help. You'll like this one. All righty. Sometimes I wonder if my bees are thinking about me too, especially now this time of year. What happens with some of our colonies this time of year? They just get big, and as they get bigger, there are more resources, there are more bees, and sometimes our bees just are a little more defensive. So I'm going to actually break this into to 3 parts as we go along this evening. As John indicated, I have written a number of books, and so this is the Africanized honeybee in Americas. It was written now a number of years ago, and I keep getting comments that I've got to update it because of all the new things, and I'll be showing some of the new things with the discussion tonight on Africanized bees. But right now, that's I think one of the better books on Africanized bees. There are several that are available. So let's open the curtain and let the show begin. I hope you won't mind if there are some senior movements that I might have as I go along and forgetting some things. Thought I'd start with a couple of very pertinent questions for you. What do honeybees do with their honey? What do honeybees do with their honey? And of course, we know that they sell it. There's yet another one of these. Hang on, okay. What does an allergic bee get? They get hives, of course. Sorry about that. Let me give you another one. If that one wasn't bad enough, let me give you another one. There are these 2 drunks that are sprawled in the gutter. One looks up and says to the other, "Look, here comes man's best friend." To which the other replies, "Aye, and it's coming with a dog." Okay. So the roadmap, I'm talking a little bit about, I'm going to start with defensive bees. Yeah, they're pretty bad. And Nick, Eric, I agree. Let's start with defensive bees because that's one of the issues many of us will have this time of year. Some basics on Africanized bees. Need we be concerned? And then circling back. So ready to saddle up and head on out? Okay, we're going to put our Napoleonic blanket on our horse and our armament, and we're ready to set off and do battle here. Oh, look, I'm a beekeeper. Oh, ouch, darn it, ouch. Where's my hive tool? Ouch, the smoker is out again. Ouch. That's what the bees might be saying. What might we be saying? Relative to this first topic in terms of defensiveness, I'm going to stop at each of these sections to have a chance for questions as well. But if you've got questions that come along, of course, you can put them in chat or just chime in, unmute yourself and chime in. I prefer not to use the term aggressive. The biology of what the bee is doing is it's defending, okay? It may seem that they come out for no reason, but they themselves do have a reason, and it's really a defensive maneuver. And to help protect what they have, we know that colony have guards. These are the older bees that are learning how to fly. These are the bees that stand at the entrance on their middle and hind pair of legs, front legs out, antenna out. And then they are the ones that are smelling, are investigating, looking at behaviors, all of those things that occur at any of the regular entrances. However, the bees that may end up stinging us in many cases are not those guards. Those guards have a post. They kind of stay at the entrance, and they're really guarding against other bees, yellow jackets, that type of thing. Often, when we open a colony, the bees that fly off of the colony, those are bees that are in the hive. They are not currently active doing something else. And so those are the bees that can be the soldier bees, the bees that will fly off often and then sting us. We know from studies by Anita Collins of USDA that bee defense is actually a four-stage response, but they go through the stages so quickly it's hard to, it's not stage one, then stop, stage two. It's kind of hard sometimes to tell. So there has to be an alerting, something that the bees are going to respond to. Again, it's defense. Then an activating of a behavior, their behavior, attracting, then going towards something, in other words, out of their hive, towards something. And then the last stage can be either stinging or a fleeing behavior. And it is not always just stinging, and this varies widely among different bees. So our typical scenario is we as the beekeeper go up to the colony, we scrape something against the colony, we set the smoker down on top and then pump the pillows. In other words, we're creating some vibration, some alerting inside the colony. We use smoke to disperse the guards, but that's not going to disperse those soldiers that are inside. So it's often some sort of, the propolis seal is tight, and so we pry the propolis and we get that snap. All those things. They're very sensitive to light. They're very sensitive to vibrations. Then that activates the soldiers. And if all of a sudden there's light or some change, then they might then fly towards the movement, fly towards a smell, for example. So they're just not flying off, but they're flying towards or towards something. And usually for beekeepers, this is at our face, as well as other animals such as skunks and bears. And it's simply because with their vision, that's the easiest for them to be able to tell that rather than a big mass of something there. Differences between colors, where a black shirt ends and skin starts, or all those facial features that we have. So they're flying towards it. Again, the smell, movement, something that looks different. And their usual method of movement or alerting towards an activation is to bounce off. In other words, not come out to sting, but to intimidate, to bounce off that, for example, our veil, or bounce off us or off the hide of a bear, whatever. And then, as I indicated, this last stage is flee or to sting. And the decision on that is individual decisions. We don't know why some will flee, others will sting. But we do know that when a bee stings an intruder, whether it's your hand, the fabric of your coveralls, or the hide of a bear or whatever, that it's going to rip out its insides. But in so doing, it's leaving an odor, an alarm odor, a chemical that's meant to attract additional soldiers, additional recruits. So the individual is giving up its own life, but in so doing, it helps magnify a defense against an intruder that persists in bothering the colony, entering the colony further, etc. When we talk about some colonies, we talk about some that are very defensive. Others are more docile. We have very gentle bees. We have lovely bees. When they're smaller, they're nice and gentle. We can open and not have bees in our face or stinging, whatever. But then there are other groupings of bees and other circumstances in which bees are defensive. And defenses isn't something that's unique. It's something that the other bees don't do. It is just those colonies that we would say, oh, that's very defensive, or gee, I'm getting stung a lot, are just colonies that are often responding more quickly and then persist. And often that is related to the fact that they are getting that chemical response. And so they're just rote behavior. They perceive this alarm, this special chemical, the enemy is marked, and so then they gang up on an enemy that keeps persisting. In other words, keep trying to enter the colony, keeps trying to scatter equipment around, etc. Now, there are a number of reasons why bees may be defensive, why a colony may be defensive. And again, it's not all the bees in a colony, but it only takes a very small percentage so that us, the beekeeper, have the impression that, boy, this colony is defensive. In many cases, it's us. We are the enemy. We are invading a colony. We are not doing it gently in some cases. We are scraping, we are vibrating, we are all of a sudden exposing them to light, different conditions, and we're moving right over the top of them. All the things that help bees in terms of being alerted and then activating towards that alert. This time of year, big colonies. They're just more bees, just more eventual soldier bees. There are more resources to defend, but it's not necessarily that factor, except that there just are more bees. So that even now, a least bit of disturbance for those big colonies can result in some amount of the population being defensive. And it doesn't take many. It really doesn't take many for us to all of a sudden say, oh, gee, that gentle colony I had all of a sudden now is attacking me. It's a very aggressive, although, like I say, I prefer defensive. Weather conditions, particularly changing conditions, are another factor. We're not in the hive at the best weather conditions, conditions in a day where the weather is changing. Hungry bees or bees that are foraging on poor resources, those that have more in their stores, all of those are colonies that can tend to be more defensive than others that don't. Responding to the stimulus of a sting. And again, some bees, such as European bees, it's kind of an investigative again. So if they perceive the alarm odor, they come figure out what's going on. Whereas other bees, including Africanized bees, they perceive that alarm odor and they sting. In other words, it's almost like a command for some bees of some genetic makeups, versus for others, it's more of a investigate, kind of see what's going on. All within the normal realm of different genetics, different biology of the colony. Queenless colonies. Queenless colonies are often more defensive. They're disorganized, and all kinds of other things go wrong in queenless colonies. Smells, particularly movement or smells in front of the colony that may or may not include vibrations. And this may be just you approaching, just walking up to. We know skunks visiting at night, disturbing colonies, but colonies located alongside of a road where all of a sudden there's construction, colonies where you've just run your string trimmer or your lawnmower in front of them, or in a neighboring yard. All of those creating different conditions than leading to a heightened defense. Disturbances, and I've included such as skunks, such as predators, and the beekeeper. Our bees don't know us, but beekeepers that develop skills in their inspection are those that understand what releases defensive behavior. And so they are more smooth in their operations, no herky-jerky, smooth in removing covers, smooth in taking out frames. All of those things that are less disturbing can then mean less stings. And so those are the skills that beekeepers will develop, many bees will develop. Changing a location of a colony, moving it from the front of the yard to the side of the yard, for example. Something different, something unique can be a factor. And finally, the one that we'll focus a little bit on tonight is genetic differences. We know there are differences in terms of defensiveness of bees of different genetic makeup. So in the realm of different bees that we might have, we know Africanized bees are more defensive generally than European bees. We know the Russian bee is a bee that's more defensive generally than European bees. We know that carniolan among the European race bees are more defensive. We know the European bee, European bee of the north, the dark bee, or what we call the German bee, that's more defensive than the Italian bees. So there are these differences that exist because of the bees and their propensity in terms of their genetic makeup, in terms of their propensity to try to be defensive of their colony. So all those are I've listed 10. We can probably come up with another 10 reasons why bees might be defensive. I've talked about the handling defensive bees, and this was in the April 2021 Bee Culture. If you don't get it, if you'd like a copy of that article with the photos and things, I'd be glad to send it to you if you just send me an email. So defensive bees. How are we going to recognize that what was a nice colony all of a sudden is defensive? It might not be with stings, but often the first indication is bees in our face. We open a colony and immediately we've got bees around the veil, bees just right in front of us. And remember, their initial reaction is not to sting, their reaction is to intimidate. So to fly at that veil, fly at something that looks different. Another way that we can often tell that a colony that may have been very gentle is now more defensive is as we walk alongside of our yard where the colonies are, or the other side of the garage, or we're just sitting on our back deck with the bees somewhere in the backyard, and bees are in our face and bees are stinging. So we're not in the colony. We haven't alerted them, disturbed them, but they are somehow have a larger defensive perimeter that might be within the yard, neighbors' yards, unfortunately, or just sitting in the yard, just doing yard work, for example. Another factor in terms of that might signal more defensive bees is an excessive response. And these can develop very, very quickly, very rapidly. And excessive would mean that all of a sudden you got a lot of bees flying around you, or all of a sudden they're stinging your hands, or they're stinging your equipment, or someone else is in the yard doing gardening, yard work, or just sitting on a deck watching you, and they start getting stung all of a sudden. After initial stings, a continued response. Now, the alarm odor does dissipate. We can blow smoke on it. We like to scrape the alarm stinger out of our skin. We can rub some sort of a chemical over it, or retreat for 5 minutes to the shade, let the bees settle back down, let those stings, the alarm odor, the stings then dissipate and then go back. But defensive bees will just pick up that response right away. So continued response. And finally, one time does not mean that you now have a defensive colony. This would be a behavior. Defense is a behavior that is part of that bee in that location, or the way you're interacting with your bees, disturbance to the bees that you may or may not be aware of, genetics of the bee, whatever. In other words, it's not a one-time event. You can all of a sudden end up with a number of stings as you're doing something. Sometimes dropping a frame, or bouncing a frame, or jarring the colony a certain way. You end up with some stings. That's not really that's immediate defense. It doesn't mean you now have a defensive colony. So defense is something that will continue often over a period of time. All right, a little bit about defensive colonies, and we're going to go on to the genetic aspects with Africanized bees. But I thought maybe we could stop at this point and see if anyone has observations, some questions that you might have, stories, comments.
Don't be shy, folks.
I have a question. I'm not going to type it.
Good.
I've read that there's a balance of smoke quantity that should be used. That's you can upset your bees if you over smoke them.
We can do anything to excess, yes, and that does include over smoking, yes. Over smoking with smoke that's not white and puffy and light, but smoker that's got like a blue smoke, a too hot a smoke, for example. Smoke has an effect. It has an immediate effect to change the guards, and then as you open the top and pull some frames out, you use the smoker. If you are an individual that's a smoke, in other words, very nervous, you get the smoker out and you keep puffing and puffing and puffing at the entrance, and once you're inside, keep puffing. Every time you pull up a frame, you keep puffing on that frame. Yeah, that's excessive, and so the smoke has a temporary effect, and too much or too little, of course, can be to the detriment, and you get defensive behaviors. So there's a sweet spot in there, a Goldilocks effect, and generally the individuals that tend to use less smoke, smoke only as they're opening, smoke only where their hands are going on a frame rather than continually across the top. Those people seem to elicit that defensive behavior less on the part of the bees. So if you are that person that tends to, we can't subdue our bees with smoke, and so if you are now that type of an individual, try cutting back and see if you're not more satisfied with less smoke rather than more. Good question. Any other questions? The one someone said in the chat that it was a recent ad by Man Lake in the journal. So thank you. Eric, I think did.
I have a question kind of along those lines. Have you ever noticed if there's any types of materials put in your smoker that might calm a defensive hive more than a different type of material?
Boy, we could debate that one forever. Are there some things that are better that elicit less defense, or are there some things that elicit more defense? And people have put various things in smokers as an aid. Nitrous compounds, for example, to knock out bees more. We don't have any decent study to indicate that some things are better than others. We do know a smoke that has a good volume of smoke, is a good white cloud of smoke, is a better smoke than that gray. If you're over or adjacent to the county and you're pumping that smoker to try to get some smoke out, that's movement, that's an activity, and the bees are perceiving all of that. And so they may respond to it as well. Or you need smoke now, and you've got to go off to the side and pump to try to get enough smoke to go ahead and smoke them. So there are obviously ideal smokers. One of the things that may happen to us as beginners and more accomplished beekeepers is, with the smokers going great, we get in and all of a sudden we see something that takes more investigation and we're looking longer. And then eventually we do something with that frame and want to look on the next one. So we pick up the smoker and the smoker has gone out, or it doesn't give us a good volume of smoke. So smokers that have that white smoke that persists, that you pick up and just a couple of puffs on the bellows and you get more smoke, those are better. And so that's all in the fuel. All right. Find a fuel that does all of those things for you, that doesn't bother you. There in Humboldt County, probably one of the best things you can add is the ganja. Add marijuana to your smoker. You'll be a lot happier. It's not going to do anything for the bees, but you're going to be a lot happier. That was a joke. All righty, let's go on and look at Africanized bees then, as advertised. Be glad to answer questions too as we go along. How come we're seeing to be, there we go. All right, so where am I on that roadmap? I said I'd look initially at defense. So now I'm going to go on. I figured out where I am in the hive, and we're going to talk about Africanized bees, some basics. All right. So the Africanized bee is a ecotype, what we call race. We call it subspecies, various things. It is an East African in its origin, all the way from the South Africa, all the way up into the Ethiopian plains and the mountains in between. It's east, not west, so it's not jungle Africa. And it's been kept by humans for as long as we believe bees have been kept in Africa. Bees spread from Asia into Africa, and from Africa northward into Europe. And so bees have been kept in Africa longer than they've been kept, for example, in Europe. And much of the beekeeping is more rustic in parts of Africa through time. And they have a couple of other pests that are not found in other parts of the world. Some birds, there's the honey badger, a ratel, that is a serious pest, digs up the nest. So this is depicts a Maasai warrior. It's nighttime, or just about nighttime. He has a fire. He has a hive that's suspended in a tree to help prevent against predation by birds and by mammals and by ants. And so he's ready to harvest it. So he builds a great big fire. He drives the bees from one end of a cylinder type of hive, drives them out of the hive, and then he starts harvesting. He takes out combs of honey and keeps going until he reaches the combs of brood, takes those out as well, and then may take out all of the combs. He'll separate the harvest. So honey is a product. The brood is another product. The wax is going to be yet another product from the colony. So he's not actually killing bees, but he's using the smoke and the fire to drive them out. And that has been for centuries a type of beekeeping that occurred with these parts of East Africa by and large migratory human individuals. And as a result of this interaction with the bees too in that part of Africa are migratory. So if there are resources, they will be in that hive. If there are no resources, they leave, they abscond. So that's the basis for what this bee has been subject to in terms of being successful where it lives in parts of East Africa. Now, it was then brought to South America by a geneticist, and the objective was to improve beekeeping in the Americas. At that time in South America, they had bees from Northern Europe. They kept some in Langstroth hives there on the left of the top right photo, or in rustic hives that were simply boxes. That's how we kept bees in the colonialists in the U.S. kept bees initially. They kept them in boxes before the middle 1800s, when Langstroth described the movable frame or Langstroth hive. And as a result of that introduction, the beekeepers and the bees have changed, beginning in the introduction into Brazil and then elsewhere in the Americas. So the geneticist was this fellow, Dewey Caron, a well-known geneticist. He had a grant from the Brazilian beekeepers, and he went around the world. He went to Asia. He looked at a lot of different bees in Africa, and his intention as a geneticist was to bring some stock to his laboratory facilities in Sao Paulo, outside of Sao Paulo, in the university, and then do some development to develop a bee that was appropriate for South America. The European bee was not a major bee for Brazil. Brazil is the fifth largest land-wise country in the world. They were like 20th in the world in honey production. And so the beekeepers thought they should be doing better. And so they thought a bee would be the difference. This is nothing new. We did the very same thing in the United States in the 1860s, when we imported Italian bees from northern Italy, because the bees that we had here coming from Spain and from northern Europe were not doing real well. And so we heard reports, beekeepers heard reports about these beekeepers in northern Italy, didn't need smokers. They just used sort of a pipe, didn't use veils most of the time, but had great production from their bees. And so there was interest in, well, let's try Italian bees here. In addition, information was forthcoming on carniolan bees from across the Adriatic Sea in Europe, the Caucasian bees further east into the Caucasus Mountains of Russia, Georgia and Russia. And the USDA actually hired a person by the name of Frank Benton, who went around to several areas in Europe, Mediterranean area primarily, and looked at bees, evaluated the bees by local beekeepers, and then made provisions to bring in some other bees. So in this period of time, the late 1800s, we brought in a bunch of bees, as many as a dozen different types. The bee from Syria, the bee from Malta, the bee from Ethiopia, the bee from Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. None of them really stuck except the Italian bee did very well, as did the carniolan bee and Caucasian bees in more northern area. So although there were a bunch of introductions, really only 3 seemed to make a difference. And so with that, then we had breeders of Langstroth was one of the first persons to bring in Italian bees. He's the one, among others, that heard about this bee and then brought him in. So what Brazil did is nothing unique, nothing different. Go to another part of the world, evaluate the bees there, bring them to the U.S. Or to South America, Brazil, and see what happened, see what would occur. Care had the idea that he was also then going to take this genetic material and breed it. Well, then an accident happened, a famous accident happened. The bees got released by accident. And then without much genetic evaluation, the university began releasing virgin queens from these bees, because they seemed to do better right away. They swarmed. They inhabited smaller cavities. They were a bit defensive, but larger scale beekeepers, that's not a factor. So the bee then unheard of, really. Well, we have introduced pests from other countries, and this is the kind of the first instance of an ecotype of a population of bees being introduced and creating problems. And this bee then took on a name called Africanized honeybee, because they thought that what it was doing was hybridizing, crossing genetically with the European bees that were in that part of Brazil. That's what they thought initially. And so it then took on the name Africanized. It had a number of other bee names, and others have been proposed. So at various times, publications have called it a Brazilian bee, an assassin bee, neotropical bee. The people in Brazil initially were calling it the extranera, the foreign bee. And then Time magazine labeled it a killer bee after they read a few stories of people that died as a result of too many bee stings. There was a very famous one of kids on a school bus. They ran into a swarm of bees. Apparently, bees were getting in the windows. The school bus veered off the road, crashed into a tree, and 2 students were killed. And so that then was ascribed to the bees killed the students. And so that was one of the stories that Time picked up, and then that's where the term killer bee developed. And then, quite unusually, the bee keeping most of its identity, in other words, what was introduced by by Care and the Brazilians, and began to spread. So that as early as 6 years, beekeepers in Paraguay were now noticing that they had a different bee. As early as in 10 years, the people in Bolivia were noticing that they had a different bee. Also into Argentina, the northern part of Argentina, the northern reaches of Uruguay, all of a sudden noticing that they have a different bee. And then people started looking at this bee and where it occurred. And so this map was then developed in terms of its spread. And where they occur, you can see some dates, for example, in Venezuela, 1977. That record is basically all of a sudden an animal getting too many stings and dying, an animal that was penned up, an animal that was tied up, or a human, a beekeeper or a member of a beekeeper family, or someone living in a rural area, no doors, no windows on the homes, which is typical of the tropical areas, bees going inside and stinging individuals a lot, and then some of those people dying. So those are what the records are based on. All of a sudden, someone dying as a result of stings. And for example, in Venezuela in 1977, 1978, and 1979, we documented over 300 individuals died, human individuals died as a result of bee stings, where records before that were kind of non-existent that someone died from a bee sting. So these are records and that developed. The bee crossed the isthmus in 1982, where I picked up the story. I captured the second swarm in Panama at the racetrack, spread down through Central America and then on into northern North America. It is in virtually all countries except an existing population in Canada and an existing population in Chile, but it is in all of the other countries and most of the islands of any size in the Caribbean. So we pick up our story as it came into the United States. It was initially into the very southern part of Texas in 1990, arrived in Arizona in 1994. And initially there was monitoring. So Texas set up a lot of traps. Arizona set up a lot of traps that attracted swarms. And then when a swarm went into a trap, someone went and collected the swarm, killed the swarm, collected adult bees, and then made a determination were these European bees or Africanized bees. And we did that on the basis of measurements of wing, basically wing measurements. Also, we use legs and wax mirrors, but mostly the wing measurements. And so the different colors here represent different years, and you can see starting in very southern tip of Texas, the colors start changing. They would then be noticed in the next couple of counties, a year after, pink, for example, then going towards Houston to green, et cetera. They did not come into California until roughly 4 years later. The population did not spread from southern Texas across Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona into California, but they came to California via Mexico, directly from Mexico. They did not then come to the East Coast, Florida shown here in the green, until much later. We predicted initially they would spread along the Gulf Coast, Mississippi, Alabama, into the panhandle of Florida. That did not occur. And so the introduction in Florida is started in the Tampa Bay area. You can see a slightly different color for Tampa Bay here. And that we believe was shipping introduction. And likewise, we have all of the large islands of the Caribbean, the same thing, a date when all of a sudden an animal was killed or a person was killed by being stung. The bees were collected, a sample taken, and then by measurements determined that they were Africanized bees. So these are not just guesses. These are, in the US, these are actual measurements of their movement. The pattern in San Diego County, very southern Arizona, Imperial County, et cetera, it was similar to Texas. After the worst of the bees is when they first colonize an area. Those are the bees that are meant to colonize. They are bees that swarm all the time, abscond all the time, are highly defensive, are not at all productive. They are a different population. Then after they are in an area, they begin to hybridize with the bees that are in the area, the beekeepers' bees, commercials, backyard beekeepers, etc. But what we have found is that they will retain many of the African characteristics in subtropical US. The question is then, as we get to Humboldt County, which is not subtropical, what's going on there? And I'll get to the story in a minute. In a study from San Diego State by Kono and Cohn in 2015, they looked at 265 bees from 91 different sites and then documented where the bees were located. More recently, Africanized honeybees have been found near Sacramento, but that spread to now Sacramento in the Bay Area is really only 155 miles further than 2006. Why I mention this is in the, for example, in the Brazilian Amazon region, we documented the spread of this bee 300 miles a year. 300 miles a year. So here we're talking about 9 years and spreading only 155 miles further north. In the 2006 study, 2015 study, 60% of the bees in San Diego County were Africanized. But when they looked at bees in managed bee colonies, in other words, went into backyards and particularly into a couple commercial beekeepers, they found a lot less bees being Africanized. And one of the things that has changed is that initially we measured wings, the wing veins. Now these measurements are done, these determinations are done by looking for markers, genetic markers, okay? So there's this one study in terms of this early look at bees in California, USA, range and frequency of Africanized honeybees in California. There's that reference. So here's the 2006 study. The C above is San Diego County, next to it, Imperial County. The red indicates population of bees that were looked at that had markers for Africanized honeybees. The green, the bees were looked at, did not have any markers of that for Africanized honeybees. And the white circles in red had some markers, but colonies did not exhibit defensive behavior at all. So there's sort of a three-way process here. They then came up the coast, looking in LA County, Santa Barbara County. In 2006, you can see everything roughly above Santa Barbara is green. In other words, not Africanized bee genetic material as of 2006 study, okay? So then the study was updated. Johnson at Davis, a couple of different people at San Diego. There's a very good bee lab, University of San Diego. He works a lot with stingless bees, works a lot with not things of practical that beekeepers are necessarily interested in, but some fascinating aspects of biology. But they did update their study, Lynn et al. And the counties in red, starting there in San Diego Imperial on up into the Bay Area, are those that had genetic material that was Africanized. Not all the bees necessarily, but did have genetic Africanized. Recall in 2006, so this is a 12-year period of time, it was only up to Santa Barbara County. So it has then spread northward. The counties in pink, Nevada County, Yolo County, where UC Davis is, that county, after Oakland County, Alameda County, the next one there, they found some degree of Africanization, but the majority of their sampling was European bees. So the bee has continued to, as documented, to spread northward. There is no active no active program now to determine where they are. There's no active trapping. There's no active attempting to capture swarms. The genetic analysis of the markers is more expensive. You need a lab. It's not as easy to do as the morphometrics. And so we don't have anything really in between. And there's no one since 2018 that is continuing these studies. And that's, if I might be able to make an editorial comment, that's political, because you see Stockton, Nevada County, we're into the area where they rear queens in California. Okay. And then, Glenn County and northward from there up to Shasta County. But all the pink are major queen rearing counties. And there is in the West Bay area some queen rearing. Lower part of the San Francisco Bay, there's some queen rearing. That's where the fires wiped out some of our commercial beekeepers a couple of years ago. So there is no active program. And other than the state of Georgia, of all of the states, there is likewise no active program to try to trap swarms and look at their markers. We ran a program in Delaware Bay, shipping into Philadelphia, Camden, New Jersey, and the Delaware Bay. The ships have to go to anchor for a while in the bay. And so on the land of both New Jersey and Delaware sides of the bay, it's not a wide bay, we had traps, and we looked at swarms year after year after year, and never found Africanization in any of those. And why that's important is because Wilmington, Delaware, and Camden, New Jersey are major shipping hubs for bananas that come up from Central America. They get about a dozen banana boats every week that come into those two ports. These are these are smaller ships. They're not controlled hulls, so a swarm could very easily find a place to live on the ship or in the ship, in the hull, to come up. But for years we looked and did not find any, and of course it took a while for them to find them in Tampa, where shipping came into Tampa. The other major shipping port on the East Coast is Jacksonville, Florida. And they did, again, initially do some active trapping there, but all those programs, Jacksonville, Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Wilmington, Delaware, none of them have active trapping, nor does California. Now, I want to introduce the other concept of what's going on with this spread. We know that as the bees came into Brazil, they then spread, indicated to Paraguay, to northern Argentina. And what happened in northern Argentina was what was set up as a hybrid zone. So the insert to the left of the map of South America, so it's this insert here. The green markers indicate those are bees that by genetic markers are indicated as Africanized. As you go south towards Buenos Aires, so Buenos Aires is about here on the river. As you go south, you see that the bees become blue. So here's what is happening as we look at this separation of bees in Argentina. So as you go further south, most of the bees are European bees, blue, a little bit of hybrid, and just a tad of Africanization. As you go north in Argentina to the border with Brazil, with Bolivia, Paraguay, you get less European bees, an area where they are hybrid between the two. So you get confusing results with your genetic markers. And then most of the genetic markers say Africanized. So that's what we call a hybrid zone. It has set up, and there is very strict control in both Uruguay, which is this country here, and in Argentina, to not allow bees to go from the north to the south. You can take bees from the south to the north, but you can't bring them back. Okay. Most of the production, Argentina is the second or third major country of honey production in the world. Most all of it is south of Buenos Aires, okay, not north. Most of the production of honey in Uruguay is the south half of the country. The northern half is cattle area and not very suitable for honeybees. So a hybrid zone is set up. Calfee and others from San Diego looked in terms of has a hybrid area set, is there a hybrid area setting up in North America? And so they're looking from the Mexican border in San Diego County on up north through LA, Orange County, on into Santa Barbara, and then all the way up into the Bay Area. And you can see the same type of thing that occurs as you are in San Diego County. Everything comes up Africanized, the red. You get some mixture, some hybrids as you get to Santa Barbara, north of LA, up above the avocado growing area, Long Big Sur. And by the time you get to the Bay Area, most everything comes up as European. So in looking at the same issue here, as you are further north, the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, most everything is blue, indicating European stock, a little bit of hybrid, a little bit of the red of Africanized bees. As you go south through the counties and you get to San Diego County, then you find the Africanized, the red Africanized. You get a bit of a hybrid zone, a mixture of the green, and then the Caucasian bee, the European bee as the blue. So there is not nearly as many data points, but it does look like perhaps also there could be a hybridization zone setting up in California. Now, the kicker in California is here, Central Valley. And the kicker is almonds. 88% of the commercial bee colonies in the United States that are capable of being moved come to the almond growing areas in basically 3 major counties of the almond growing area of the Central Valley. And the issue is then they're there for pollination and then they leave, except some beekeepers, such as those in New Mexico and some other states, use the time while their bees are there to start rearing queens, including a couple people in Oregon. And so the kicker in all of this is this area is, as we would look at it, they did not make samples here in this particular study. As you look at it, you would again get this line, this hybridization line that occurs in the valley. So it depends where the bees are pollinating almonds and where they go afterwards with the spread of material. Based on where they were in the United States, using the supercomputers on one of the national agencies in Washington, D.C., myself and a few others looked in terms of where they might go based on where they already were in the United States. And we put in a number of environmental parameters: rainfall, temperature, lowest winter temperature, longest temperature below 10 degrees, et cetera, et cetera. And we developed this type of a map where blue illustrates that is not at all suitable, very low suitability for Africanized bee genetic material. The darker orange is where they already are, so highly suitable for the bees. And so you can see by looking at the distribution, you can see that this distribution of lighter colors is throughout the queen rearing area of California, and certainly through the Central Valley, into Nevada, into the Colorado. So not just the first tier of states, into Colorado, into Oklahoma, Kansas as well. Good populations in Oklahoma, very heavy populations in Arkansas, moved into Missouri. What is strange here is the blueness of Mississippi and Alabama. And that really is in sync with they're not there. They're generally not there, Africanized honeybees. The kicker in all of this is the state of Georgia that has an official policy that there are no Africanized honeybees in the state of Florida and Georgia. That is their policy. And they investigate stinging incidents, but are doing no trapping. And yet you can see that a lot of the state of Georgia, the lower half certainly is very suitable habitat based on the lightness of the color. And so the distribution would be smiles up the West Coast, smiles up the East Coast in terms of their suitability based on where they already were. Another study then looked at them from a different perspective. People at Colorado State with another supercomputer looked at some other factors, and they concluded that they will potentially arrive in all but the very northern tier of states of the US and into the Canadian provinces along the West Coast, British Columbia, and along the East Coast, Maritime, Ontario, and Quebec. So pick your study, which study you want to try to concentrate on. Let me go back there. So what is where you are? The feral, the wild honeybees in your area may or may not be Africanized. They can be from summer swarms, from colonies brought up by beekeepers that went to pollinate almonds, or from packages, or from nukes that were in that area and then were sold to you in the county. The honeybee swarms much more frequently than do our honeybees, and multiplying as fast as possible is simply a great survival instinct because it also keeps them ahead of mites. My bees in Bolivia, I don't treat for mites. I don't have to, my Africanized bees, because the bees take care of the mites. The bees are gleaners. They do not wait to be stimulated by hive conditioned scouts before leaving home to forage. So they're out first thing in the morning, and they will then suck plants dry of their resources. By the time European bees are out and start foraging, there are no resources left because Africanized bees in the area have harvested all the resources of pollen and nectar. They're not good honey storers. If the forage conditions are poor, they leave. That's called absconding. Simply leave the area to look for better forage. In Africa, that's a very adaptive strategy because they don't have to go very far and they find better forage. South America, that's an adaptive strategy. In temperate areas, that is not, because if you had a colony that absconds in September in Humboldt County, there's almost no chance it's going to survive, virtually no chance. There just are not enough resources for the bees to build comb, rear enough winter bees, and survive the winter that then comes to the county. So it's not an adaptive behavior, but this is the biology of the bee, and where it exists in Africa and in South America, it is adaptive behavior. And so it's a genetic trait that is going to persist in the population. If they live in Humboldt County, it means the death of the county if they abscond late. But if they are in San Diego County and they leave, they may find better resources. So it is adaptive, at least in some part of their where they live. There's not one means by which they become dominant. There are multiple biological means to maintain their own genetic identity. Queens in their mating, the time of day that the queens mate with their own drones, the fact that they raise drones immediately upon the availability of resources. Our bees rear queens and start swarming really towards the end of a resource time. These bees do it immediately at the beginning. There is some indication that they are selecting Africanized drones, the queens are. And finally, if there is a mixed mating of a queen, it takes a very small percentage of the Africanized drone sperm, genetic material, to make that colony defensive. We estimate that as small as 15% of the workers that might have the inheritance from a drone father who's Africanized, that colony to you will seem more defensive. In other words, a defensive colony. And finally, the way that commercial beekeepers in San Diego and elsewhere are able to maintain their stock is they requeen regularly. And really, seriously, commercial beekeepers do not mind a defensive bee. They don't obviously like stings, but there are a lot of things that individuals like about defensive bees if you're a commercial beekeeper. Particularly, it keeps other animals and people out of the apiary and theft down, et cetera, if you have bees that are more defensive, et cetera. So all of those factors then are aspects of Africanized bees in your area. Now, what about our prediction that they're going to kill lots of people? It has happened. Our defense is with animals that are stung, that are corralled, or can't escape. They're in a cage of some sort. Or humans, old people that stumble onto a nest, something disturbs a nest, and then they attack a person that's just walking by on the sidewalk, et cetera, et cetera. But the initial forecast that they are, they're going to kill all the people and we can't keep bees, can't keep these bees, et cetera, has not proven to be valid. They are more defensive. And accidents do occur, but it's not been a human threat, human health issue that has occurred with all of that. Unlike the murder hornet that have a very bad reputation. Okay. And of course, people have gone gaga over the murder hornet, and it's in a very small area of Washington County. So what's happened? They've changed beekeeping and beekeepers. Beekeepers learn how to keep them. They keep colonies small. They are well protected themselves against any defensiveness. And you only build up a population of Africanized bees when you want to accomplish something. In other words, there's a pollen flow coming on, you want to requeen, there's propolis flow coming on, or a nectar flow coming on. You then all of a sudden divide a colony and let it build up for about a month. And then you have a very decent colony that can store some resources. And then you have to keep taking the resources away, because this bee, once it gets a couple of frames of honey, it tends to quit. It's done. It's got enough. So you have to build them up quickly, which they do very nicely, and harvest some of them continuously. All righty. Some aspects of the bee, and particularly I've emphasized some aspects of California here. Are there some questions or comments? Or
there's a question in chat. Dewey, are you keeping AHBs in Bolivia for research and educational purposes? Do you have special clothing to protect yourself?
I keep them because I have no other alternative. We cannot keep European bees alongside Africanized honeybees. They simply go downhill, while the Africanized honeybees will store us some surplus. So I don't have a choice. We have had programs where we brought in thousands of European queens from US, from Europe, from Hawaii, and they're all dead within a year, and the Africanized bees are going on. Do I have specific clothing? No. Do I get stung a lot? Yes. That's just the cost of doing business.
So hypothetically, let's say you had Africanized honeybees in bear country, would you need electric fence, or would they take care of that?
The bear would cause some destruction, and in the ideal world, the bear would get too many stings. Same with a skunk, would get too many, and so would give up and switch to another food resource. But that's hypothetical. It's there's no data to test it one way or the other.
Anybody else?
I have a question. Who are the people to talk to about getting testing in California going? Where would that come from?
That's a great question, and it's a loaded question because no one wants the testing. No one that's a large-scale beekeeper. So you would really, really be fighting against a strong stream to try to get some testing going. All the research right now is UC Santa Barbara, but Brian Johnson at UC Davis has a strong interest. He has been on the last couple papers. So you might start a dialogue with Brian Johnson or of course, the extension specialist, Alina. Try to talk with Alina, might be a possibility. California has put back in play some money to bolster their inspection program. Now, I don't know if you've seen any of it in Humboldt County at all, but some counties have not seen any of that money. But CalFAC, California Department of Ag, has some advocates for bees. And so it would be interesting to have a regular monitoring by capturing of swarms, and then some funding made available so that they could do the genetic analysis looking for the markers. The other thing we need to have done is some research to not just look for the 3 major markers, but look for some of the other markers as well. So it's, boy, the research is the only lab of the U.S. Department of Agriculture that's done anything. It's been Gloria DeGrande Hoffman of the USDA Tucson lab. And as I said, UC San Diego, and Brian Johnson at Davis.
Do you have a figure on how much it costs to do a DNA test instead of everybody, the beekeepers rumoring that's around $300? So is it more? Is it less? Do you have an actual figure?
So the piece of equipment is, we're looking at a couple $1 million, and it needs a technician to run it. And then the actual sample, running the sample, is about $300 to actually run it. But the cost is really in getting the piece of equipment and getting a technician to run it. I think all this work was done. I think San Diego, the biology department there, has the machine. I don't think Brian has one at Davis.
Does UCLA have one?
Probably for other functions, but it's not much. It's not too difficult to set with the machine, to set up a person, train them to run these samples, and then run them. Supposedly your tax dollars were to go to a facility at USDA in Tucson, in a Tucson USDA laboratory, to do this analysis. They did it for a year, and then there was an announcement that there was so little interest that they stopped doing it after the expenditure of lots of money. So,
well, there's a lot of people in I'm in that Los Angeles area, and there's a lot of people here that would love to get their bees tested. They just don't want to pay $300 to do it.
oh, indeed. Yep, indeed. Yep. We are finding bees all of a sudden that become very defensive just everywhere.
Do Africanized queens look different
No.
than European for color or
Color, size? The workers are roughly 10% smaller, but you have one in one hand, one in the other. You wouldn't be able to pick out that little bit of a difference.
They
No.
seem to be runnier from what I've observed.
Their behavior is different, but there have been some very famous studies early on where, based on behavior, they categorize this as an Africanized bee and this is a European bee. For example, in Costa Rica, some more, in Guatemala, another in Mexico, and so then they did the analysis. They finally got the analysis back, and they found that they had some in the wrong category. But someone with a little bit of experience can usually pick out on their behavior. So it's running on the comb. It's the noisiness when it's open, the jumping off, the intimidating around the veil. We can test defensiveness by alerting a colony. We hit a colony with a metal ball, and then we have an oscillating arm in front of the entrance that has a piece of felt on it, and it then is run for 1 minute. The arm goes up and down, waving this piece of black felt material. In defensive colonies, you'll get well over 100 stings in 1 minute. In our European colonies, you may get no stings, but often as few as less than a dozen stings in 1 minute. So it's, waving the proverbial red flag in front of the bull. Here it's a black felt piece in front of a colony that's been alerted by just one hit with a metal ball. The metal ball is held out about 10 inches and let the bounce against the top box. That's it. That's the alert. They're very sensitive.
Okay.
How much cross hive alerting happens if something is disturbing one colony, but the other colonies aren't physically receiving those vibrations or those movements, but they're within communication range with bees from the disturbed colony? Will that message be spread?
The message is spread by stings in something, in beekeeper clothing, for example, and then the alarm odor. So that odor will go from one colony to another. Now, how close do the colonies have to be? There are some variables, how many stings you get, how much alarm odor, which way the wind is blowing, all of those factors. We do know combined colonies on one hive stand, often it's transmitted by the vibrations to adjacent colonies that are on separate hive stands, somewhat insulated from the ground, for example, on individual cinder blocks or something of that nature. The colonies further in the different places in the apiary may or may not have that alarm odor spread. What we do when we work in an apiary is we know a bit of the past history and when we've done divides on our colony. So when I go into an apiary, and we'll have anywhere from 2 to 10 colonies in an apiary, I'll know which colonies are the ones that are less defensive when I go into the apiary. So I'll open those colonies first. And I'll continue, and in a number of instances, depending on the day, depending on how big the colonies are, how much resources there are days where I cannot get through all 10 colonies. I just have so many bees in the air, so many bees stinging my equipment, so many flying wings that we eventually have to start shouting to the second person working with us. We do never go into an apiary by one person. We always have a second person. And you actually have to shout above the noise of the bees flying in your face and around your body. And so in a number of instances, we don't get through all 10 colonies. We start with the gentlest and hope that we get through all 10, how many there are, how many, 5, 6, 10 colonies. But in many instances, we do not. We then leave the apiary, get into a vehicle with all of our equipment in place, drive down, open the windows, shoo bees out, drive a couple ways again. And we'll go finally a couple miles away before we want to try to take off of our equipment in the vehicle. And then the vehicles have bees in them until the bees die, basically.
How long do you wait?
You don't want to get your
before going
spouse
back?
into the same vehicle. You don't want to put your spouse in the same vehicle the next day. I'm sorry, go ahead.
How long do you wait before going back?
Great question. You do never want to open a colony the second time. And we can do that with European bees, but often they're a little bit more defensive the second time. So you want to, if you're going to need to augment that colony or do something with it, you leave it open after you've opened it. And then we will not go back to the apiary generally for a couple of days. Now, I have gone back the next day because we dropped the high tool or we forgot the smoker, and they're sitting there waiting for you. You get out of your vehicle fully clothed. And yet there are other days we get through all 10 counties and hardly a sting. So.
Hey, Cheryl's got a question. Well, she had her hand up anyway.
Yeah, if you accidentally squish a bee, do they even get more pissed?
Yeah, often that will release alarm odor, and so that's an alerting. Yeah, So you try not to squash, try not to squish.
Yeah, right.
The one place I will squish is once they're inside the veil. That makes you nervous. And so you try to catch them in the veil fabric. And then wherever you squish it, for example, down here in the fabric material,
Yeah.
then you'll have a whole, you can get it, it'll be black with bees because you've just released some larm odor when you squish that bee.
Wow. Thanks.
Really take the
I quit
romance.
after 100 stings. I usually tend to say that's enough,
Yeah.
time to leave. And they're stinging right through your equipment is what's going on.
Mhm. Mhm.
Wow. Yeah, really take the
No,
romance out of
thank you.
beekeeping there.
Yeah, and that's what's happened to the hobby class. So most of the beekeeping in tropical America and into subtropical is people that want to keep bees because they're getting some resource from them. So it's rural people. Our model for training beekeepers, and I started this in Panama, and I've done it in a number of countries, and more recently now in Bolivia. Our model is we will take and go to a community with some funding. We'll take a week's period of time to train beekeepers in that community. Every day they come to training, they get a piece of equipment that's theirs free to take with them. And we give them lunch, and that's a huge incentive because it's a better lunch than they'll get at home. And at the end, and about half of the training is in bees, not talking to them. We don't get much chance to talk to them very much because I speak in Spanish, and often it is then translated to a native language. So in Bolivia, that's Quechua, or that's Amara, or the Chaco languages of the tropical area. And so you don't get a chance to say very many words. You have to be very basic. All your examples are of other animals. The best of beekeepers are those that have a little bit of property. So in communities, when we go in for a training program, the mayor and the muckety mucks of the community have gotten the money, so they come for the training, never ever become beekeepers. But we get a few more rural young families and landowners that have cattle, and they have space, in other words, and they become the beekeepers. We evaluate after a couple years, see how many people are still keeping bees, how they're doing. And the numbers usually look pretty good. It's less than 50% in the second year are still trying to keep bees. And then after 5 years, if we don't dare go back and evaluate, because what happens after 5 years is all those other people have dropped out. They've had bad stinging incidences. Something has happened. And it's just the landowners that eventually buy up the bee equipment, and they're the ones that now have equipment for 30, 40 colonies. We teach Langstroth beekeeping, but as you got way back up in the hills, and that's the best area for beekeeping in Bolivia is the Andes Mountains. So these are narrow mountain valleys. There, as many as half of the colonies are just put in some sort of a box. In other words, a rustic hive. Communities where more people start beekeeping, a local carpenter starts building the equipment, and so more of them will have Langstroth type equipment in their colonies.
Hey, Hank.
How
Hank,
much is it to
Dr. Caron,
transfer
I have
how
a
much-
question. Is the venom any different than the European bees?
No,
Strong, or is it the same composition?
it's the same. Theoretically, it's 10% less because their body size is smaller, but boy, I couldn't swear to it.
how much is it for shipping of Langstroth hives to
Made
Bolivia?
locally. No, they can't. We could not ship formic acid or any of those stuff. It's just way too expensive. This is all very basic beekeeping. it goes back to the beekeeping that occurred at Langstroth times. You put them in a box and then you go back and you steal honey from them. In this more city areas, communities that have more than 50,000 people, often there's a couple of queen breeders, at least one, a couple of queen breeders that are trying to improve stock. And so there'll be more beekeeping in the immediate suburbs of those communities. Many of the Andean valleys are fruit production and dairy cows. And both of those are just excellent for bees. So those are the best areas. The honey in the tropics is dark, strongly flavored. Does not sell in the international market because it has a high level of hydroxymethylfurfenol, or HMF, which is a toxic sugar. Heat affects the honey, and so on the international market, they don't buy that type of honey. A lot of the honey is called organic because these are back in the areas where there isn't an awful lot of agriculture. Much of that honey is sold in Bolivia, at least, to Brazil, where it's exported. But where we have cooperatives of strawberry growers, cooperatives of fruit growers, cooperatives of coffee growers. The cooperatives take on a project to help. In all of an agriculture, there's a period of time, the lean months, where you're not harvesting something. So in coffee, there's like 5 months of the year that are lean. You're not harvesting any coffee. So there's no income at all coming into the family. Shade-grown coffee needs a lot of different vegetation above the coffee plants. And all of that can be beekeeping vegetation appropriate for bees, okay? And so bees and coffee go very well together. During those 5 lean months, the beekeepers have some honey to sell. If they then are in a cooperative, and that's almost all coffee growers are in a cooperative. So they sell it to the cooperative, and then all the marketing is done through the cooperative. They'll have office in the bigger cities. Caritas, the Catholic relief agency, will send it through the priest into the bigger cities, and they'll sell them at the fairs around the Catholic Church. If the beekeeper has to sell his or her honey in the local community, like producers everywhere, you get nothing. You get virtually pennies for all that effort that you have. Our effort is that with communities that get going is to try to have a good, clean extraction of the honey, so that it's a product that can be sold in the cities or can be exported through the cooperative. If individuals are not in a cooperative, they're getting almost nothing for their honey, and in some cases you wouldn't want to eat it yourself. It's pretty dirty. It's pretty ugly looking.
Are the cooperatives fair trade cooperatives?
Some are. Yep, some are.
Okay.
So for example, in a shipment of coffee going out, there'll be room in the container, and so that they can add containers of honey in that, or containers of propolis. My wife's family have been beekeepers going back to a grandfather who was a fruit grower, and so I inherited him when I got married 30 years ago. I now have a nephew that takes care of him. The nephew has 2 kids, and we harvest for about 30 colonies. He does. I just go along and make sure he's doing it the right way, just getting away basically. And 30 colonies he has a pretty good life. He's bringing in a fair amount of income. Now, I must say that another family member has 5 pharmacies, and so the honey is sold on the counter of the pharmacy, and we sell actually very little honey per se. We sell it in 2 and 4 ounce containers, but we put a lot of propolis in with the honey, and we have not been able to keep stock of our product because parts of the Americas, the cultures of the America, believe that propolis is an anti-COVID medicine. There's no evidence for that at all, but they believe that. And so mixed with it, you get a sore throat with COVID, and the honey is good for that. And then throwing in the propolis, you're then curing the virus. So we just can't keep up with stock. The problem is our bees abscond. So it's the dry season right now. And the bees have abscond. So we've only got maybe 5 or 6 colonies that are actively going. We'll very soon, it's the middle of winter. So as we're into the next quarter here, the first quarter of the year, in a month or so, we'll start putting boxes out, and the absconds will come back, and they'll start inhabiting these boxes. And then we just start dividing like crazy.
Hey Dewey, are we in the middle of your presentation, or are all these questions okay?
These questions are okay. The last part was just a little bit about me in Bolivia, so
Okay.
I'm fine to end it here.
Oh, no, we can keep going. I didn't know if you had more presentation.
I think I had some more slides, yeah, but
Well, you want to finish those slides?
yeah, let's look at them, see what we got. Yeah,
Okay.
let me show you a little bit about Bolivia. I first encountered them in '82 in Panama, and now I keep part of them for each year in Bolivia. So these are some looks. This is myself and the nephew looking at our colonies. We divided that colony. That's why they're counter lever on we have to protect against ants. Ants are a real reason why bees abscond all the time. That photo on the left is an interesting one. That was at the University of Panama, and we heard lots of screaming and yelling. And then we went back to the major part of campus, which was just beyond the woods over there, and no one was around. And just by opening the colony, we unleashed an awful defensive behavior that drove everyone off the campus that day. But don't tell anyone that's what happened. So here's where I go now. Bolivia is in the middle of South America. They're landlocked. They have some access to barge traffic on the river. And where the best parts are here, this is all of the rivers that start some of the Amazon basin. And so these mountain valleys that are these beginning of the rivers, these are just the major rivers. There's lots and lots of minor ones, and each of those is a valley. And each of those up to about 9,000 feet is a pretty good area. To the left of there is the Andean country. And so La Paz is at 12,000 feet is elevation, one of the highest capitals. That's too high for bees. And the tropics then, as you follow the rivers down, get less and less suitable for a quality honey. And that's where you start getting into the competition from stingless bees, the native bees of the Americas. So we have bees in the city. So here on the left, that's the major dome of the major cathedral on the major square. So just around there is the major square, and these are bees up on the 3rd floor. Here's a major hog operation just on the other side of that fence. And so with selected stock, you can keep bees in a city. And we're very careful of when they're looked at, and colonies are kept small so you don't get the release of any defensiveness. Standing where I am and taking this picture, I had a black camera in front of me, and all of a sudden I have lots of bees just standing that far away, taking a photo of those colonies. But here I am as well. Those are mating nukes of 2nd tier. Those are starter colonies, the lower tier. We keep bees in small boxes, shallow super, remove it quickly. The bees use propolis. They are quick to swarm, abscond, as usurp. Usurp is where the colonies take over other colonies. We look at them as little as possible and divide them to keep them small, productive, and gentle. And of course, here gentleness is a relative term. But the family comes and goes. You can see the beekeeper leaning against a truck there. So he drives his truck in and out from the main gate. And so this is selected stock. This is a breeding operation. And here's the president of the British Columbia Beekeepers down looking at, this is queen rearing in a city. We get them up to queen cells, and then we move the queen cells out to the country. And then we do an awful lot of eliminating of queens. We do an awful lot of splitting. So we're all the time needing queen cells, and this is selected stock. And so the rearing in a city here on a rooftop works. The bees, part of my bees are over over the peak of that roof up there in the foothills up above where there is not very many people, a lot fewer people up there. Problem number one is queens, finding queens. They're very light adversive. They run around. So it's nearly impossible to go into an Africanized bee colony to find a queen. And of course, we want a pincher. So what we do is we go to a colony that's getting a little big and we split it 3 ways, putting 2 frames of brood in each of leaving 2 frames, putting 2 frames in another box, 2 frames in another box, and then putting a queen cell in all of them. One of them will still have the queen and those queen cells will be killed, but there's no way we can find which portion has the queen. So it's a sort of a basic walk away type splitting and putting queen cells in, and let the one portion with the queen kill those queen cells that we put in. So problem number one is finding the queen. Problem number two is their swarming behavior and going into buildings and structures, and then any removal that a removal from a building, as you know, even with our bees, can go wrong very quickly. And so trying to get them out of structures and out of buildings is a real challenge. They don't cotton very well to vacuum machines. In most cases, you just need to run as much soapy water in there as you can to get rid of them, rather than trying to get them out of there. Okay. And problem number three is colonies that we would throw away here, having no bees. You can see here, I'm looking at a colony. That's the extent of the bees that were in the colony. A few that went over to the left here to look at to fill their tummies with food, and here's where their brood area is. You can see very few bees here on another frame. So we would throw that colony away here. It's not very good. Once resources become available, this colony just simply explodes and will fill the whole box. And then what we're doing is, you can see the outer frame here is a lighter color. So the outer frame is our harvest frame. They will explode in there, rear brood like crazy, and then store some resources in here. And then we keep taking the resources out to keep them active until they finally abscond. They finally leave for the season. So it's a real different management. Non-problem number one is this cat. Of course, we do not have mite problems. This race of bees, Africanized bees, have learned how to control varroa. As we've added more European material into the bees, in other words, more hybridization, we sometimes will have problems with varroa, but there is a strong selection for uncapping, recapping by bees, Africanized bees. And so what they do is the bees discover the cells that have Mrs. Mite in there. They uncap it. The mite runs out, but we've interrupted the reproduction. And then if there's only one mite in there, usually the bees recap the cell. And so we don't have to control the mites in these bees. It's not an issue. The virus pattern remains to be a mixture of the viruses, including the real serious ones, the DWV viruses and the chronic bee paralysis virus and the acute bee paralysis viruses, but it's only a mix of viruses. And so unlike here, what happens with our bees with mites feeding on our pupae is you get enhancement of those 2 viruses, and then you get the epidemic, and then the virus epidemic kills our bees here. So do we need to be concerned? The last point I wanted to try to make here, there really is no simple answer to this. They are getting and starting to infiltrate into the area in which we're rearing a lot of queens in California. We're bringing colonies that have Africanized bee genetic material from California to other places in the U.S. We've got 2 Oregon beekeepers that rear their queens in California at the end of almonds before they bring their bees back and then sell nukes here. And there are 2 distinct regions, and in both of those, we're getting lots and lots of reports of very defensive bees, of people not being able to keep their bees from stinging animals and stinging people and just taking the fun out of beekeeping. And it's related to rearing queens in the lower part of the valley of where the almonds are, not up so much in the Stockton area, but Madera County and particularly the lower part of the valley.
Butte County?
No, not nearly a serious problem in Butte County yet. Nope.
Okay.
No,
Stanislaus?
not so much in Stanislaus. Madera, the other M1, the three major areas.
Modesto.
Modesto County is one of the other ones. Yeah, Madera, Modesto, and I wish I could think of it. There's almonds in like a dozen different California counties, but the three major ones where almonds are those two and one other one. So finally, back to circle back around with defensive bees. What can we do? Again, it might be just something very temporary. So trying to handle these defensive colonies, don't, unless you really need to, let them be. What happens with the incursion of genetic material of Africanized bees is that sperm from that drone or drones is used up. And so the colony may be very defensive for a period of time, but then later on is not nearly as defensive. And it's because the sperm from the Africanized bee drone has been used up by the queen as she's fertilized eggs from the spermatheca, and now she's back into the mating of more European drones. Avoid movement, vibration, individual hive stands. Certainly use PPE, personal protective equipment. Be prepared. Manipulate only when necessary during appropriate weather conditions, and manipulate, do things towards the end of the day rather than the first thing in the morning. And that gives the bees a chance to try to settle down overnight. Be fast but gentle. Avoid excessive time-consuming manipulations. Manipulate weaker, smaller colonies if experiences versus full-size units. Keep colonies small. Split, requeen units with select queen cells. Harvest frequently. And then if you do have a defensive colony and it becomes an issue, you go anywhere near the apiary, you start getting stung. It starts affecting other colonies. The bees from that other colony, get rid of it, euthanize the colony. We don't do that enough. Bees that have issues with drone brood, bees that have disease issues, sac brood, we don't euthanize enough. With other animals that we might keep for production, for example, we'll get rid of the weak. We'll get rid of those that are not doing well. We tend not to do that with bees. We're trying to keep even the weak ones alive. So get rid of them, and instead of spending 80% of your time on 20% of the colonies that aren't going anywhere, use that time, that 80% of your time on strong colonies and only 20% on those weaklings and colonies that will never do anything for you. So a few suggestions. You notice I'm wearing, I'm not wearing leather gloves. I'm wearing gloves that you do household chores around, et cetera. They'll sting through them. But I think you get finer touch. One of the easiest ways to get stings is go into bees with leather gloves, the goat skin gloves. They just accumulate the stings. So we're trying to use gloves that don't accumulate the stings as much. And you notice I use only a half jacket almost all the time. I'll start sweating, so I'll get stings in the shoulders and my arms, and they'll sting the front of my jeans. I'll get a lot of stings in the front of my jeans. And when it gets to the point where you start acting like a robot, you don't want to bring an arm down against your body anywhere. You're sort of moving like a robot. Nothing touches anything else. It's time to quit the apiary. There's no sense trying to avoid stings any longer. That's it. That was any other questions, Eric? Or
Yeah, do you want me to read these?
we got some in the chat. Sure.
Yep.
Wow. Look at lit up. Okay.
You want to just go through them?
Sure. Let me go through them. I'll go back up to the beginning. Yeah, come on. Slip up there. Okay. Jay, did you say that? Okay, we're talking about those original swarms. Man Lake just posted, Erica posted that one on the easy check, use CO2. What about ice cold sugar water? I heard that recently for removals from Holly. Ice cold.
Yeah, I just heard about that.
For removals of
Africanized bees. It seems to shock them for a few moments.
Huh. Okay. Good. I've not tried it. I've used cannabis leaf and smoker to try to calm the bees. Result, not sure, but it's no. I don't think it has any effect on the bees, but it might help us. Eric, love him. Does defensive behavior in one colony trigger defensive behavior in a neighboring colony, assuming that the second colony is not experiencing the same disturbance? Yes, that disturbance does follow, and I think that is, well, the vibrations, of course, with a common hive stand or the bees flying around, and these are soldier bees. Many of them are not very familiar with their surroundings, so they end up going to other colonies. So the more you have them open, the more the bees are wandering into other colonies, and then you start getting stings in your equipment. So those two factors, yes. So disturbance passing from one to another. Is there a sweet distance to have them apart? Not really. As I say, trying to figure out which are less defensive, starting with those, working to those that are much more defensive. Oops. Okay. Dewey, are you keeping AHBs in Bolivia for research and education? Do you have special clothing? I talked a little bit about that. I'll show the clothing. I have done a lot of research with the bees in Bolivia. Yep. But the family, it's for the nephew now, for the nephew to his family income. Do Africanized queens look different than European color? No, there's a big color range in both of them. No, you can't tell just by looking at the color of the workers or the queens or their size. What is some new information that you include? A new edition of AHBs? What is some new information? Well, I'd included this information on the some of what I emphasize on what's been done in California, and that's the book I now have talks about some successes beekeepers have had in various countries, and so I have more of those type of stories that I would include. Can Africanized foragers recruit the new brood to be highly defensive by a European queen? No, it's not a recruitment. It's that queen that mates that ends up mating with some drones that are Africanized drones. And so in her spermatheca, she only accepts a certain amount of sperm from each of the matings, and some matings no sperm. Okay, so at any one time, she's using sperm from a variety of drones. So you have subsets of sisters in a colony, and if their father, the drone, is one of these Africanized bee drones, then they have that propensity to swarm. And as soon as colonies get as little as 15% Africanized worker bees, we define them as being defensive. We find their behavior is changing. It doesn't take very much. Off the top of my head, to be with my two queen single super hive you briefly mentioned last year. Good news. Oh, great news, Jackie, Mark. Do you clean or launder the protective wear on any routine basis? Yeah, try to. Families of beekeepers have this tendency to have bee sting allergies. It's much higher than in the general population. So the beekeeper needs to do this rather than giving it to someone else. And of course, in much of this part of the world, that someone else is an employee. So you yourself really need to wash it, not just throw it into laundry, and someone else touching those stings can then develop that allergy. Any idea Jamaica is doing our AHBs? I do not know specifically Jamaica. We have some good information from Cuba. We have pretty good information from Puerto Rico. In both cases, they have very aggressive programs to kill new introductions. And so within the populations, they have been doing some selecting. And so they have bees that we would look at and we would say genetically they're Africanized honeybees, but they're not nearly as defensive as the bees, let's say, from Mexico or the bees from South Texas or San Diego County. So they are controlling the introduction of new material that way. And by the way, in both those large, and also the island of Hispaniola. Of course, I've done a fair amount of work in Haiti and also in Dominican Republic, and the North Shore is very highly defensive bees, but for whatever reason, Port-au-Prince in south and the area around Santo Domingo and Dominican Republic are much more gentle bees. It's that's where most of the queen rearing is perhaps that's some of the difference in Dominican Republic for sure. European honeybees can fly 3 miles to forage. Same for HHBs. I don't know that's been measured, but I wouldn't predict it would be any different. Part of the most parts of the dog last year. Okay, who keeps the bees when you aren't there? My nephew. I only get in the way when I go down. I'm down about 3 to 5 months of any 1 year. What do you love the most about keeping Africanized bees? There's nothing. It really takes the fun out of keeping bees. You know, I'm delighted that a nephew is now being able to live off about 30 harvest from 30 colonies. He was trained in the entomology or agronomy department of the university and couldn't find good employment. And so, you know, not everyone can become a beekeeper, but I am delighted that he is. He's in my my bee biology book. Weird question. Using up the sperm, does the sperm stay in sections, groups, not mixed all willy-nilly together, like will she lay for days with only sperm from one drone? No to the last part of it, but there is mixing, but it's not an entirely fully mixing. So what happens is sperm from some matings is used up, but then she's into sperm from an earlier mating. So it's not stratified, but earlier matings, that sperm would not be the sperm often used until later in her life. The sperm from the more recent matings would be the sperm that's used. But yes, there is some mixing. So it's not all the sperm from the same father and then switching to another sperm from another donor from another father. So there is some mixing, yes, in the sperm. Feel like that is a metaphor for a lot of things. This 80-20, isn't that the truth? I talked about spending 80% of the time on 20%. I'm sorry, 80% of the time on things that never get you anywhere versus 20% where you should be concentrating your time. Bees have no CBD receptors. Cannabis won't help. Okay. Thank you, Sharon. I'm sure that's true. Sharon has a lovely photo of males collecting pollen from cannabis. They will collect pollen. They will collect from aphids and scale insects that are on the cannabis. So they will collect a nectar or sugary substance from cannabis, but most, if you see them on it, it's usually the male plant. No, I was being facetious, Sharon. You know that you know. I've already had a smoker contest already this year, and I always give an award for the person that puts cannabis in their smoker. Dumb question. Does an AHB drone have defensive behavior? Only soldier type? No, the drones are not at all defensive. They're like a lot of honeybees, Africanized honeybees want drones around, but you know, the way that they control mites, varroa mites, is they raise drones only very early in their reproductive cycle, and then they stop. And so unlike European bees that will raise, I mean, they're raising drones this time of year. Africanized honeybees, no, only in the very beginning. And so the way that they control is they raise drones early in the year. The drones drift to other colonies and become part of the drone population of their European counterpart colonies. But then they are Africanized bees do not readily accept drifting drones. And so they've got a whole, it's the same way the European bee, Apis cerana, manages varroa mites, okay, through the drones. You can't raise varroa mites on the worker bees of Apis cerana, and basically we can't raise enough replacement mites on worker bees in Africanized bees. And so that's why we don't have to do varroa mite control, because the population of mites never reaches high enough that then they start changing the patterns of viruses. So you don't get the epidemic of viruses. And then on top of that, we've got this recapping behavior that the workers are very good at with Africanized bees. So it's biology, that's how they control mites. We think pharaoh colonies control it by swarming. That's one of the suggestions of Tom Seeley from some of his work. Are Africanized honeybees a threat to the stingless honeybees found in the Maya region of Mexico? They are, to the degree that they are pigs. Our bees, honeybees, are weedy, go to weedy plants, and these things have such high populations that they go out and they collect all the resources very quickly from other plants. So there's less available. Now, a very early study in Panama looked at that and said that Africanized honeybees were replacing native bees in studies that were done in Bardo, Colorado Island, which is in an island in the middle of the Panama Canal. However, that the study was flawed, and Dave Rubik's gone back and looked at his data and restudied it. And it turns out, no, when Africanized bees came into Barro, Colorado Island, into Panama, the Isthmus of Panama, they have their favorites. The honeybees have their favorites that they collect on. The native bees that were there then started switching to their favorites as well. And so often there's not direct competition between honeybees foraging on plants and native bees foraging on plants. So there's a partition of those resources. For example, here, you probably never ever see bees on Shasta daisies, but you'll see some wild bees on Shasta daisies. We'll see Anthidium. I just saw today Anthidium on one of that's a wild bee species, a cavity nester. You'll see some of the mining bees on the daisy. And so that's a partition of the environment. Honeybees not using the nectar and pollen from the daisy versus other bees that are using it. So what happens with stingless bees and honeybees in an area is the stingless bees are using certain resources for their pollen and nectar, and honeybees are using other resources, and there's not often direct competition on the same plant species for the two different populations of bees. So what is really endangered in the Mayan honeybee, the stingless bees of the Americas, the native bees that were here before we brought honeybees, what is really threatened is their culture. We're losing the culture of the older people that knew how to do it, of their keeping them in buildings, keeping them around their properties. We harvest stingless bee honey from only about a half a dozen species, and there's probably 300 species of native bees, and so we're losing those species and how to culture them and how they live, because people are not doing it any longer. They're concentrating on either honeybees or these three species of the stingless bees. And stingless bee honey is different from honeybee honey. And the native healers do not equate honeybee honey as their healing substance. They are after, depends how far back you go in the bush, but as you get off of the cities, the native healers, you don't go to pharmacies, you go to native healers, and you say what your symptoms are. I have a constant headache, or my wife isn't conceiving, whatever. And they'll mix up some potent and often to help that get all those shavings of bark and those ugly seeds and those plant scrapings down, is they mix it with honey. And so honey helps the medicine go down, right? And they don't mix it with honeybee honey. They mix it with stingless bee honey, native bee honey, and it's a very watery honey. We think of honey that's above 18.6 as liable to fermentation. Stingless bee honey typically is in the area of 21 to 25% moisture. So if our Apis mellifera honey was in that level of moisture, it would ferment very quickly, but the stingless bee honey does not.
Wow.
But otherwise, someone's looked at the honeys and they're essentially the same. So I think that was the last one. Oh, thank you, Rachel. Very nice.
Well, thank you, Dewey. Any other questions? Now's the time, folks.
So I kind of missed part of it because I was on a lawnmower earlier trying to listen, and that didn't work. But did you mention about the Africanized honeybee and the European and hybridization? Can you go over that quickly?
I did. You can't keep Africanized honeybees adjacent to European bees. Initially, there was very little hybridization. They kept the characteristics of Africanized honeybees, but there have been some major breeding programs to try to bring in more European genetic material into the Africanized honeybee stock. Most of that has been in Mexico and Brazil, the only two countries that could really afford to have a breeding program as such. People in between, there are efforts in areas in the bigger valleys of Cochabamba to try to select bees that are more appropriate for that location, just as there are local selection programs throughout the United States of trying to make a bee better selected for that particular location. But most of them are trying to select within the Africanized bee population, not to bring in European stock. The more European stock you bring into the Africanized honeybees, for example, in Mexico, they do have to treat for mites because you're bringing in that inability of European bees to fight the mite. They just don't have that ability, and that's why we as beekeepers are constantly fighting the mite. So, I wanted to show you one other thing, and that is, I think Eric or no, John held up the earlier book. So here's the new one. Here's the new honeybee biology. Yep, there we go. Eric has the
Have the old one.
9 years, but I had updated the mites in 2018 and some other stuff. So this is 2 new chapters. A whole big chapter on nukes has become a real way to manage bees. So if you'd like a copy, I'd be glad to send you one. I have a special price if you'd like to get one. Just give me an email that you're interested, and I'll let you know what the price is. Sorry for the commercial, but I thought I'd throw it in. Why not?
That's an important plug.
Why not? Yeah. There in that last one, you can see is my email, DM Caron. I still use the UDEL EDU as my email.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dewey. That was exceptional.
Thank you.
Is it okay if
you.
I put this recording on our YouTube channel?
You are. Yes. I see you recorded it. Yes. Yep.
Okay.
So please do so.
Great. Thank you.